All right, so I will get started. Okay, so welcome everybody to our cinema and conversation about Kelly Reichardt. We are so excited today to welcome Dr. Chelsea Wessels and Dr. Matthew Holtmeier. Chelsea was my professor at Colby for a film genre class, so I can vouch for her firsthand, don't worry. So they both received their PhDs at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and have taught together and apart at Ithaca College, Cornell University, Western Washington University, and Colby College. They now teach at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, where they co-direct the Film and Media Studies minor. So just so you guys know, the discussion tonight will be a little bit more participatory than a couple of our previous cinema and conversations. So just priming everybody now, be ready to use, to be typing in the chat and the Q&A, and really start thinking about the film that you saw or films. So yeah, so with that, I will turn it over to Chelsea and Matt.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. And there we go. Okay, now give me one moment, to pull up the chat for me. Nope. Okay, maybe I won't look at the chat for right now. I'll figure that one out later. But actually, we have a starting question. So since everyone watched a different Kelly Reichardt film, we're kind of gonna organize our talk, our sort of introduction to Kelly Reichardt around some key themes in her work and just do a brief introduction to her, and then kind of ask you to be sharing in the chat your thoughts as we go so that we can kind of pause and have conversations, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So let's start with just a little introduction to Kelly Reichardt. There she is. Okay, so Kelly Reichardt, and again, if everyone's seen a film, you probably know a little bit about her, but I just want to give a little bit of background information. So Kelly Reichardt is an independent artisanal filmmaker. She started making film in the 90s and made her directorial debut with River of Grass in 1994. So River of Grass was nominated for a Sundance Grand Jury Prize and 3 Independent Spirit Awards. So it kind of is like a big premiere when she makes her first feature film. But she doesn't make another feature film until 2006 when she makes Old Joy. And one of the things that's kind of significant here is that she really attributes this sort of gap where she doesn't make feature films. She did make a few shorts in that time to the difficulty of fundraising as a woman. And she actually used an inheritance to partially finance Old Joy in 2006. But since she made Old Joy, she's made a new film every 2 or 3 years. So she's an incredibly prolific filmmaker in a lot of ways, and very productive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In general, Reichardt has a pretty realist style. You probably noticed that. So I saw in the chat briefly that somebody watched River of Grass and Meek's Cutoff, and you probably saw a real shift in her style between those films. But she's one of the directors that a few years ago, like a decade ago, A.O. Scott named in this article he wrote about neo-neorealism, where he identified a group of filmmakers working in the late 2009 era that were kind of like responding to Italian neorealism. And Italian neorealism, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a post-World War II movement that had a focus on like historical moment, like that post-war moment. Used a lot of location shooting and non-professional actors and really emphasized social issues. So A.O. Scott kind of picks up on that historical thread and applies it to some of the more contemporary filmmakers, thinking about kind of like the resurgence of this neorealist style and that social issue focus. So that's something to think about in terms of defining Kelly Reichardt's style, and we'll talk a little bit more about how her style kind of connects with her themes. I also kind of I mentioned that Kelly Reichardt might be thought of as an artisanal filmmaker. And one of the things that's significant about her is that she writes, edits, and directs her own films. So Writer-director is something we might think of from a lot of like so-called auteurs, but she also edits. And so she has a great deal of control over her films, and she has a very consistent style between her films. Another element of this is that she also has a pretty consistent stable of collaborators. So John Raymond wrote the short stories that a number of her films are based on. He collaborated with her on a number of scripts. She often uses the same cinematographer, Christopher Beauvais. So she has this very consistent style and sort of group of collaborators that she works with, and that kind of makes her work really interesting to talk about across all of these different films that have very different, topics, narratives, I guess, but have kind of these consistent themes. So what we thought we would do today is kind of outline 3 key themes across her work very briefly, and each theme, like, we'll have a question about it, so you can kind of put what you think in the chat, like how you noticed it in the films that you watched, and we can kind of have a little discussion along the way. So the 3 themes are region, women, and precarity. So we'll start with region.
All right, so just a warning that, oops, I'm on. So my computer just restarted just a second ago. So if I disappear, Chelsea, I hope you just take off for wherever I'm at. So we're gonna talk about region next, and we're using the term region because it's sort of like a set of different interests in the environment. So when we say region here, we could think about it in terms of region, bioregion, where the films are set, and just the environment and the film sort of use of the environment. So while many films might treat the space of a film as if it could be anywhere, and I'm thinking of Marc Augé's concept of the non-place. He has this book on supermodernity, and these are basically universal locations. He uses the example of an airport. If you go to an airport, it could be any airport, right? There's some differences between certain airports, perhaps, but they are created as this space where anybody can traverse it and be familiar with the space. And a lot of films sort of do this as well. Like, the setting of the film could be anywhere. That's not the case with Kelly Reichardt's films. She often emphasizes the particular places and spaces and environments in which she sets her films. So for example, her first film, River of Grass, and I lost the chat. I lost the chat when my computer restarted, but I saw that somebody said they had seen River of Grass. And River of Grass is set in the Florida Everglades and Dade County more specifically, right? So a particular environment, a particular place in the US, and the film opens with a monologue that discusses how Native Americans gave the environment this name, the River of Grass, and also how urban development is encroaching on this quote unquote river of grass. So there's this sort of like meditation on environment in that film. It's sort of an interesting case too in River of Grass. Maybe we'll talk about that in a bit, because we'd say, the film isn't really like, that's not the primary point of the narrative, but there's sort of like this insistence on it anyway. And we'll see that in a lot of her films. And just like an anecdote here, I actually taught that film once to a class where there was a student from Dade County, and he was just like, yeah, man, this movie is so Dade County. And I'm still not really sure what he meant by that, but apparently she did a good job of capturing the spirit of the place in this instance. But starting with Old Joy, and this is in 2006, and I think Chelsea sort of mentioned sort of gap in her filmmaking. Old Joy in 94, and then in 2006 we have, River of Grass in 94, Old Joy in 2006. And starting with Old Joy, she starts setting a lot of her films in the Pacific Northwest. So Dade County, a particular place, it's sort of where she's from. That film is sort of autobiographical in many respects. Then she moves to the Pacific Northwest, and then she starts, focusing on the particular environments of the Pacific Northwest. And I think Chelsea probably already mentioned the collaboration with John Raymond, the writer, and he's a Portland, Oregon writer, so he's sort of a place-based writer too. He has a couple of like short story collections that are short stories set in and around Oregon in the Pacific Northwest as well. So it's part of that collaboration too, I guess. Certain Women in 2016 did move to Montana, but conspicuously so. Like, it's a very Montana film. There's a sort of a focus on a ranch and the sort of mountains of Montana. And then first Cow moved back to Oregon. So like basically, you know, all of her films, all of her feature-length films set in the particular places, all but 2 in the Pacific Northwest. So, but beyond where she sort of sets and shoots her films, because, you know, in one respect, it's the place where she makes the films, right? In another respect, it's the cinematography and how she shoots the films, and how she emphasizes the role that the environments play within her films. So in one article, I refer to this as quote unquote phatic cinematography. And phatic language is a term linguists use to refer to the when we communicate with people, you know, when we're thinking what to say next. And the purpose of those ums and ahs is to maintain, or this is sort of what the linguists say, it's to maintain like an emotional connection with the person you're communicating with, right? So it's not meaningless language, and it's not even language, because sometimes I think we maybe think of it as being like, oh, the person doesn't know what to say next, so they or ah, and I guess that's part of it too. But it's really, I'm umming to maintain that connection with you, right? So my argument in this particular article, and if anybody wants this article and you don't have access to a university library or something like that, you could just email me and I'll just send it to you. But the argument in this article is that Reichardt uses the environments or shots of the environment, cinematography emphasizing the environment, or, you know, quote unquote B-roll footage of the environment to serve this phatic function. And it maintains a relationship, an emotional connection between the characters and the environments in which they exist. So for example, in Old Joy, does anyone watch Old Joy? Has anyone seen Old Joy? Yeah, again, the chat's gone for me, but
Cohen watched Old Joy.
Cool. Good choice, Cohen. But Old Joy follows a pair of men as they rekindle an old friendship. And the film is sort of melancholy in that it reflects on the fact that like both of these guys, you know, they're like friends back in college or whatever, and have like grown up, sort of like matured, grown apart as they matured in these different directions. Actually, I think if you watch the film, like maybe one of them matured and the other one kind of didn't. But in their, you know, growing older, their paths sort of diverged, and they lost connection with one another. But the film is about them going on a camping trip to sort of rekindle that friendship. And there's this one sequence in that film where they're going camping and they're sort of lost, and they end up at this campsite at night, and you know, they're whatever, they're shooting the shit, drinking some beers, remembering the good old days, and then they go to sleep for the night. And then there's this scene when they wake up, and I'm going to actually show that scene right now. This is what they wake up to. I think I'll show it first, and then we can talk about it. Oh, give me 1 minute. When my computer restarted, it also took all my clips with it. But here it is. It's opening. Sorry, everyone.
It's okay. We're getting to the good content already in the chat, which is Lucy is really the star. We should have had a section completely on Lucy, who is the dog in Old Joy, and in Wendy and Lucy.
Yeah, that's fourth theme right there.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. All right, so like I said, the film's kind of, how did that look in the video, by the way, for you all in the chat? Was that okay? Never know with Zoom. Or was it choppy? I'm asking that just for my own curiosity's sake. But anyway, let me know. I'll check later. But so the film, I said the film is kind of melancholy in the fact that it's looking at the sort of divergent life paths of these two individuals, and they sort of wake up in this campsite, and the campsite is sort of spoiled, right? Like there's something spoiled about their relationship too. So the environment itself is being used to sort of like reflect on the relationship between these two guys. But you can see in these shots or the sequence how the film really emphasizes the environment that they're in. And the framing is really interesting here too, right? So we have a few, at the beginning, we have a few inserts of the trash itself. So like, you know, this is Reichardt, the film really telling us that we're supposed to be, you know, I don't know, bothered by this trash. We're supposed to notice the trash for a particular reason or something like that. But they basically pitch their tents in a dump. But after that, then the framing is sort of cut in half laterally. So we have the bottom half of the frame, usually with the spoiled campsite, and then the top half of the frame has that sort of tree-covered mountains in the distance, right, in the sky, and it looks quite beautiful. It is the Pacific Northwest. And then the final shot of the sequence is particularly interesting too, because they sort of walk out of the frame, and then the camera just sort of lingers on the environment that they've left. And I think the sequence is sort of useful too, because they never talk in this sequence, right? It's kind of a long sequence where, I don't know, maybe you think that this is what it's like when you go camping with your friends in the morning, you're all groggy and you don't want to talk to each other. Maybe you had too much beer the night before, like these guys, I don't know. But by not providing any dialogue, you know, it really changes the purpose of this sequence, right? It's no longer dialogue or plot driven in this instance. You know, we're left to just sit and meditate on these images. And that's something that John Raymond actually said in an interview about Kelly Reichardt's films and why he likes collaborating with her, right, as the writer, is because in his own writing, he'll often put these sort of long descriptive passages. And he says that Kelly Reichardt really knows how to capture those more meditative moments. And Kelly Reichardt really knows how to let the viewer sort of sit and think and ruminate on the images rather than constantly driving them forward, right? And so part of the idea here is that the environment then plays like a sort of key role in doing just this, right? So similarly, night moves, and I guess we see night moves is on the top left here, and the bottom right there is Old Joy in terms of those stills. But Night Moves follows a group of environmental activists who commit a serious act of violence, and the guilt causes paranoia to set in. And this is another film where the environment reflects the mental state of the characters. Well, it's a pretty different way, because in Night Moves, it's like the woods that were once this place of solace for the characters. One of them works on like an organic farm. Well, Jesse Eisenberg on the top left there. Starts to get really paranoid, and suddenly the woods become this sort of menacing place, right? They're like, the FBI might be watching us right now. And so in this respect, the characters are pushed out of the environments that they once inhabited. But again, it's the film's reflection on those environments via the cinematography that helps tell the story of the sort of mental degradation in the film. So yeah, the sort of set of broad themes we're outlining here, those three broad themes, are definitely intertwined as well, though. The first film I mentioned, River of Grass, is partly about the Florida Everglades, but it's partly about a disenfranchised housewife, Cozy. Similarly, Meek's Cutoff is invested in landscape, but it's really about the women in this group traveling to Oregon. So we're going to use that as a sort of transition to the next broader theme there.
Okay, there we go. I put in the chat just a follow-up question, just in case, if you have any other thoughts on the environment before we transition, but we can always come back to any of these points at the end, or if you have questions. But yeah, feel free to be using the chat to offer your thoughts along the way. kind of the drawback to the webinar format is that you can't interrupt us, but one of us can always be looking at the chat while we're talking at you. Okay, so thinking about women, there's this funny exchange in this interview that Kelly Reichardt gives in one of the books about her, and the interviewer basically is asking her a question about being a working filmmaker, and Kelly Reichardt like immediately interrupts her and is just like, "Oh, I'm so glad you didn't say a woman filmmaker," and this is just kind of like a trend in a lot of her press, but she really like pushes back on kind of like, you know, defining her as a woman filmmaker. And she might push back on that, but a lot of her films really do foreground women. And in particular, I'm thinking about River of Grass, Wendy and Lucy, Meek's Cutoff, and Certain Women. Although First Cow is about two men, I would argue that Evie the cow is the star. So maybe we can include First Cow here if we're expanding our notion of women to include cows. I don't know the word for if there's a female cow word. Okay, anyways, so in River of Grass, the first film, these are out of order on my slide, I'm realizing. Cozy is a bored housewife who ends up on the run after an accidental shooting. Unfortunately, her life of crime involves very little actual running or even crime, and mostly involves sitting around seedy hotels, breaking back into some guy's house. The film actually even ends with her being stuck in traffic. So I like this poster that's up here on the image where it says, "A girl, a gun, and nowhere to go." Another one of Kelly Reichardt's sort of failed road movies. And in fact, genre might be something we can return to later. Wendy and Lucy is about a young woman trying to get to Alaska to find work who gets waylaid in a small town when her dog goes missing. Meek's Cutoff is based on historical events, follows a family attempting a shortcut across Oregon. As their water supply dwindles, it appears their guide, Meek, has gotten them lost, and the group debates whether or not to follow him or try to devise their own plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about Meek's Cutoff in a moment. Certain Women is made up of three stories that are sort of lightly interconnected, but they're actually not connected through cross-cutting. They're presented sort of sequentially, which is an interesting choice. There's a lawyer, Laura Dern, dealing with men who won't take her seriously. A wife, Michelle Williams, who is obsessed with getting the right sandstone for the house her husband is going to build her. And a lonely ranch hand seeking connection with a young lawyer teaching her night class. So that's Lily Gladstone and Kristen Stewart. I offer these plot summaries not just for those of you that haven't seen them, but also to note a pattern across the films that I think extends to the rest of Reichardt's work, but is particularly emphasized with her female characters. These women are often stuck. They're either stuck in a place or they're stuck in a role like wife, mother, girlfriend. And sometimes they're stuck in both. So formally, Reichardt's style, I think, really tends to emphasize this. And she does this often by emphasizing the routines and the work of women. And these are the types of shots and actions that are often overlooked in commercial cinema. So it's really significant that Reichardt spends time on them. So I'm going to zoom in on one example here, thinking about Meek's Cutoff, which is one of her Westerns. The Western is traditionally a very male genre. A very action-centered male genre. So usually the central protagonist is a cowboy, a man who's good at navigating this tension between civilization and the wild that's at the heart of the genre. In Meek's Cutoff, the cowboy figure is Stephen Meek, who is the guide, and he appears to be wildly ineffective at his job and spends much of the film being pretty useless. So in contrast to Stephen Meek as maybe our cowboy figure, we have Emily Tetherow, who's played by Michelle Williams. And the film's audiovisual style really centers Emily and the other women in the party as they kind of perform this like sort of endless domestic labor of life on the trail. So they set up camp, they gather firewood, they cook, they clean, and then they do it all over again. Like the film really emphasizes that. So frequently by centering the women, the film ends up actually kind of muting the conversations of the men to emphasize sort of the sidelining of women by their domestic labor. So we'll watch a quick clip to see what this looks like.
We came from.
Sorry, I can't remember if I hit the share sound. Ah, I did.
And there's nothing ahead, so I'm saying north. We'll move closer to Columbia that way. We can rejoin the communication. I see your thing.
This is intentionally quiet, by the way.
How many days to the Columbia think about?
Too many. West is the goal. The sooner we get moving west, the better. The quickest way west, by my reckoning, south.
Mr. Gately, do you have an opinion? I think north, too.
No, I'm advising against that. Now, I've been all through this country more or less, and by God, you contracted me to get you to the valley. I will.
Yeah, we have stakeholders. But you work for us, Mr. Brooks. You'll be paid. Just, we're not going around. We're going north.
Suit yourselves. We'll do what we do.
Two shots if we find water.
What is it, Emily?
Okay, so there's a couple things going on in that clip, which it sort of begins right when they've come to a body of water, which seems like it's going to be, you know, the relief they've been looking for, but turns out it isn't drinkable. And the men sort of hand the oxen off to the women and then go down and have this little discussion about, okay, what should we do? And Lynn, you said that you were glad there were subtitles, but in this case, like in a number, there's a few other sequences like this. The men are sort of intentionally muted, right? Because we're supposed to be focusing on the women. And so we kind of get through the framing, we can tell that our perspective is staying with the women as they hold the oxen. And then after the men decide they're going to ride off in different directions to look for water, the focus stays on the women setting up the camp and kind of going back into their endless domestic labor. So we kind of have this perspective shift where Reichardt is emphasizing the way that women are left out of these conversations. And this is a pretty big strain of like ecofeminist film criticism, is thinking about the way that, well, not even film criticism, just ecofeminism in general, is thinking about the way that women are left out of conversations because they are busy with domestic labor. So while the men ostensibly go to take action, the women are left to set up camp, and we kind of get this focus on something that wouldn't normally be present in these kinds of films, in particular in the Western. And most Westerns, especially Westerns directed by men, don't really have this kind of emphasis on all the labor it takes to like make camp, cook things, you know, just provide this sort of like camp life. So the domestic work that often happens in the background of these films, women cooking dinner, making fires, cleaning houses, usually isn't shown. But here, this work is moved to the foreground. And the women's work here becomes the real work of survival. And you get kind of a sense of that at the end, where Emily is out gathering wood, and we have you know, the appearance of the mysterious Indian figure that we don't really know much about yet. And she immediately runs back and loads the gun and shoots it. So we have no sense of the men, you know, playing any part of this. And again, it's because the women are there doing this work of survival. And I think that's interesting. Like later, if you watch Meek's Cutoff, the big shootout of Meek's Cutoff doesn't play the way you might expect. Spoiler alert, it definitely involves Emily, and it involves it involves no shooting. But there are guns, and Emily is holding one of them. So this emphasis on labor and kind of this basic work of living is loosely connected to the third theme we want to talk about with Kelly Reichardt, which is the theme of precarity. Ooh.
All right, so we're starting with a definition of precarity here, but it's a state of persistent uncertainty or insecurity with regard to employment, income, and living standards. And so as a concept, it provides a sort of reflection on economic insecurity made increasingly visible today by things like the quote unquote gig economy, right? So our question for this section is, you know, did any of the films you watched, or how did the films you watch address this question of precarity in them? And so while Meek's Cutoff and the struggles of the settlers to survive is like a form of precarity, right? We could also look at it from a historical perspective. Wendy and Lucy was released in 2008 during the US financial crisis. So in an interview with Gus Van Sant, who is another filmmaker, similar in indie cred, I guess, to Reichardt, but in an interview with Gus Van Sant, Reichardt highlighted the attitudes that inspired Wendy and Lucy. And she said, quote, "The seeds of Wendy and Lucy happened shortly after Hurricane Katrina. After hearing talk about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and hearing the presumption that people's lives were so precarious due to some laziness on their part, John, the writer, John and I were musing on the idea of having no net. Let's say your bootstraps floated away. How do you get out of your situation totally on your own without help from the government? We were watching a lot of Italian neorealism and thinking that the themes of those films seemed to ring true for life in America in the Bush years. There's a certain kind of help that society will give and certain help it won't give," end quote. It's kind of interesting that she directly references Italian neorealism there. I think Chelsea mentioned the neorealism article in the introduction, right? And that's, of course, sort of an updating or reflection on how are the themes of Italian neorealism, which is a post-World War II phenomenon, carried forward to the present today. So it's kind of cool hearing Reichardt talk about how she was watching those post-war films. But in Wendy and Lucy, for example, the main character, Wendy, is traveling with her dog, Lucy, to take a job in the Alaskan canneries. Her car breaks down, which precipitates a series of problems for Wendy. Her resources dwindle, and she finds herself stuck in a small town in Oregon with limited options. In the film, Wendy runs a tight budget, and she has just enough to get to Alaska. And the film shows us this very conspicuously. There's a sequence, even just a single shot, but it's a long shot, where it's a close-up of her budget, and she's tabulating the expenses. And because her car breaks down, she goes to a shop and works in that expense. And she's like, okay, do I still have enough to get to Alaska, basically? But it's a tight budget, just enough to get there. And because her car breaks down, she resorts to shoplifting to feed her dog, and herself probably. But Wendy is arrested, and while arrested, her dog Lucy goes missing, which allows the film to explore what happens when not only material possessions are lost, but also these emotional connections. And I'm going to play a short clip there from Wendy and Lucy. And in fact, just for the sake of time, I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So this is her car that's broken down, and she's essentially living in at this point.
How's the dog?
Nah, no news.
No luck at the pound?
Not yet.
I had a collie once that was gone for 2 weeks before he came home. They'll find her. They always get their dog.
Yeah, sure hope so. Could I trade you for a quarter? I need to use that payphone over there, and all I've got's change, and it only takes quarters.
Lots of minutes. Feel free.
No.
No one uses a payphone anymore. Come on.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Wendy Carroll. I lost my dog, Lucy, and, yeah, hi. Well, I was just calling to check and see if there was any new information. Okay, all right, I understand. I'll keep checking. Okay, thank you. Bye. How late are you here tonight?
At 8 o'clock. 8 to 8.
Okay.
Better than my last job, I'll tell you that. That was all night, every night.
Not a lot of jobs around here, huh?
I'll say. I don't know what the people do all day. Used to be a mill, but it's been closed a long time now. Don't know what they do.
Can't get a job without an address anyway. Or a phone.
You can't get an address without an address. You can't get a job without a job. It's all fixed.
That's why I'm going to Alaska. Here they need people.
I hear it's real pretty up there.
Yeah.
You know, if you need a contact for the pound or anything, I'm just standing here with my hands in my pockets all day. You can use my phone number if you like, you know.
Yeah. I might do that. That'd be good.
So for those of you that didn't watch Wendy and Lucy, this security guard sort of just present working at this grocery store, and he sort of moves her out of this parking lot because he says, you know, it's company policy, you can't park here overnight, and he sort of helps her push her car. Oh, hold on, sorry, I had a clip playing in the background. I'm like, is somebody eating potato chips right now? But so he sort of helps her push her car out of the parking lot and just onto the street where you saw it, like just off the parking lot. And he becomes a sort of sympathetic character, and sort of like Seer-like character who's just like sitting there all day watching the economies change, watching society change and unfold. He makes that comment about the mill. And I originally wrote a chapter in my book, Contemporary Political Cinema, which is about contemporary political cinema, about Wendy and Lucy. It got removed, but the book itself sort of reflects on global precarity as a general theme. And one of the things you notice is if you look at a broad set of films, a lot of these films that deal with questions of precarity have an interesting take on narrative structure. So the precarity in most of these films sort of destabilizes traditional narrative structure. For example, what happens in a film like Wendy and Lucy when there's the idea of a clear narrative, and that is Wendy is going to go to Alaska to work in the canneries to, you know, make a living and make a home for Lucy or something like that. Is the conclusion Wendy then arriving at Alaska and starting up her job at the canneries? And does the film then end there? And the answer is no. And this is big spoilers. So if you don't want Wendy and Lucy spoiled, mute your speakers for a moment. I'll wave my hands when you can unmute. But it's pretty important for the conversation. The film ends with Wendy leaving Lucy in this town in Oregon, in what appears to be a good home. Lucy has a nice yard now, you know, she's no longer living in a car. That's nice. But Wendy hops on a train because her car is broken down and is irreparable, I guess, at this point, and heads north on this train. And the film was based on the John Raymond story called Train Choir. So there's that connection there. And presumably she'll make it to Alaska without her car, without most of her possessions, maybe most importantly, without her dog, right? And that loss is the emotional draw of this film. I was just telling somebody today, you know, it's like, well, what Reichardt film should I start with? And I was like, oh, Wendy and Lucy, you know? And I realized, you know, okay, maybe that's not the best choice because, I don't know, I feel like you cry a lot when you watch Wendy and Lucy. But, so in other words, the film doesn't really end with a conclusion, like she is still en route to somewhere, but with the loss itself. And I think a lot of these films about precarity ask that question, you know, what do we lose due to precarity? And how does the film refocus our attention on this loss? It never gives us that satisfaction of the neatly wrapped up ending. And I think that Reichardt would not want us to have that satisfaction, right, with this particular story, even though that's usually what we want from a film. So in that respect, all of Reichardt's films pretty much end, not with narrative conclusion, but a moment in the lives of the characters that we've been watching transform over the course of the film. In other words, they don't necessarily arrive somewhere, and often it seems like the films end with folks right about where they started. So in Meek's Cutoff, the characters are lost for most of the film, and in the end of the film, they're still lost. In Certain Women, the lives of the women maybe intersect throughout the film, but are not drastically reconfigured as a result. First Cow actually begins with the ending through the discovery of skeletons in the present in this sort of framing narrative. So I suppose in that respect, in that film, we know that the film ends in death. So in reflecting on the ending of Reichardt's films is probably a good place to end our discussion of her films. And like the ending of Reichardt films, we don't have to have a definite conclusion. We can sort of turn to conversation about these films.
I was going to add to, speaking of Wendy and Lucy, while we wait for, I don't know if I can pull up the questions on here, but speaking of Wendy and Lucy, I think that loss that you talk about, Matt, is so poignant in the scene because you see the way that she's so reluctant to accept help from the security guard or like help from anyone else. And it's like really kind of like, she just doesn't think anyone else is no one will do this for her and no one is going to actually help her. And I think that like, denial of community and relationship is such a like striking side effect of precarity because when you're precarious you're denied community.
That's interesting too, because there's well, I already mentioned the tabulating the expenses, right? So like that's a good detail of or evidence as to why she doesn't expect it, you know, or how we know she doesn't expect it. There's also a phone call with her family in that film too, which is an interesting one. And they basically kind of treat her like a deadbeat, really.
Yeah. But I like that Wendy and Lucy doesn't provide backstory for Wendy. It doesn't give us that kind of like we don't really know why she's in this position. And I think that kind of, again, also speaks to that like idea that, you know, this could happen to anyone. We don't really know. Like, did Wendy make bad choices? Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe, maybe not.
Or maybe it was just coronavirus, right? So we could have a Wendy and Lucy version 2020.
Yeah. I mean, when we were talking about what we wanted to, you know, focus on with Reichardt for this in terms of just kind of introducing her and digging into her just a little bit, we were thinking about kind of the way that, you know, a lot of the issues that her films deal with are so relevant right now. I mean, they were relevant when she was making her films, but they still like really, they really resonate right now, thinking about the environment, and in particular, like her films, when they deal with the environment, deal with like degradation, right? And I think that that's obviously really significant right now. Economic uncertainty, yeah. Wendy and Lucy could be the COVID movie. And yeah. Does anyone have, I was like, this feels like, you know, shouting into the void, but does anyone have questions, comments to throw into the chat?
It's a good point, Sarah, about Wendy and Lucy. Especially, you mentioned the scene where she is arrested and she's in the back of the cop car. And that's, I feel like I have more anxiety in that sequence than she does, you're right. But that's a really interesting sequence too, because it emphasizes how long she's like spends in the holding cell, basically, right? Getting fingerprinted and stuff like that. While as viewers, we're all like, what about the dog, you know?
Yeah. And Cohen like thinking about the editing and the way that it doesn't draw attention to Cookie falling and hitting his head. I mean, it's sort of like this sense of elliptical editing, right? Like Reichardt uses sort of these ellipses where we go from one thing to another, and it's not necessarily based around like that action or that like sort of order, disorder, order restored. Reichardt definitely rejects that narrative form, but I think her editing itself also rejects that sense of like, here's, you know, here's what's important and here's what we should focus on too. Like, it's not very directed. You know, I always think about in Wendy and Lucy, the use of so many long shots, right? Long shots and long takes that let you sort of reflect and sit with the images, but also kind of choose what you want to look at.
It's probably significant. And I know, Chelsea, you mentioned this in the introduction, but it's interesting that we're talking about the editing so much, given that, you know, she's also the editor of her films. And that's pretty unusual, right? Not that one can't be a good director and editor, but those are usually roles that are separated. In that respect, she has a lot of control over her films too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I think backstory in general is something that Reichardt doesn't really do, because I was thinking also in Meek's Cutoff, like you get a little bit of like who these characters are, but really you just join them on the journey and you leave them on the journey.
That's right. In Night Moves, they're like in the middle of planning their well, an act of terrorism, really. But we never see them coming to that conclusion. We focus mostly on the aftermath, which I think is kind of the interesting part there. More focus on the aftermath than the leading up to.
And Sarah, conversation with, what are our thoughts on Reichardt's conversation with toxic masculinity? Are you thinking of something specific here, or just in general, the way that she treats this across her films? Sorry, it's like I speak into the void and hope you will respond via chat.
I could see maybe a little bit of that in River of Grass, and maybe in Night Moves too. I don't know if anyone else, has any specific instances to throw out. In River of Grass, there's, it's like an anti Bonnie and Clyde, right? Where they're like, this couple is they're just going to be rebels and get out of Dodge, but that's failed. And in that respect, I think there's sort of like a lack of masculinity in general in her films. Maybe that's a weird thing to say, but.
Okay, you were thinking about First Cow, because I was going to say, I mean, I think she often has these male characters that are troubling. Like I was thinking of the Jared Harris character in Certain Women, but the absence of women in First Cow. I also noticed that, minus Evie, who was wonderful.
Those are two different Sarahs, though, that are.
Oh, sorry.
They might not be related.
I was like, Sarah. No, you're right.
but Sarah Gleason's point, actually, in the beginning of it reminds me in the beginning of First Cow. There's the that's the best example of toxic masculinity, I guess. It's the group of whatever trappers or whatever they are, and they're harassing Cookie because he's a cook.
Yeah. Oh, Charlie, that young man who catches her shoplifting is so striking, and I think so relevant to the ways in which people don't understand precarity or even poverty if they haven't experienced it, right? Like he's just so like shoplifting is wrong, and then he goes and gets in the car with his mom and like gets driven home, and it's like he probably has no idea what he's just done, right? Because he just sees it in this sort of like black and white. Oh, Cheryl, I'm so glad you asked about that sequence with Meek talking about women are chaos and men are destruction, because that is my other, I've given a number of talks on Meek's Cutoff specifically, and that is my go-to clip for this film. I actually did not show it this time because I thought I would change things up, but I think it's such a powerful sequence about just kind of like Meek just says things, but I love that he's saying these things about men are destruction when technically he is kind of proving his own point because he is leading this party into destruction. But what I love about that sequence is while he's saying these things that are just like vaguely unfounded and sort of like rambly in his way, you just have the women sitting there knitting, and they're just knitting. And they're continuing to create, like he's like, women are also creation, and they're just sitting there creating the things that, like scarves that men might need to stay warm, right? Like they're actually there doing the real work and like doing these very practical things that need to be done, while the man who is supposed to be leading them is, rambling. And I think Meek really is like a critical view of like masculinity and in particular its portrayal in the Western genre, right? This idea that the cowboy has this special connection to nature and to the land, and therefore he can like lead this party, and all we see is that doesn't happen.
Julia, I think that's a good perspective on that film, because in the end, they all have that paranoia, but their responses to it are pretty different, aren't they? And Jesse Eisenberg's response is violence, right? Directed at Dakota Fanning in particular. So I think that's pretty telling. Good point about Aaliyah Shawkat on the organic farm there too. I mean, it's like there's like a chance for redemption there, which he sort of gives up, right?
Yeah, and I think that's another way, Julia, that Reichardt, I mean, she does make films where women are, the central characters, but she also just like, she uses women in a way that kind of like always centers them, even if they're not centered. I guess First Cow maybe being the exception, but like, they, in Night Moves, like, much of this is about Jesse Eisenberg's character, but the women also provide all of these other perspectives on the situation and on the ways that guilt can impact us.
There's the other guy too, because there's sort of a trio that are planning to blow up this dam, and or that do blow up the dam. And the other guy kind of just disappears entirely.
So we have a question in the Q&A box from Claire. And Claire, you are giving us a perfect excuse to talk about our forthcoming article on Meek's cutoff specifically and Eden. Claire wanted to know what peripheral production is. And that's something that I think ties together a lot of what we've referenced in this talk, but we didn't really specifically, we did not, but we didn't really specifically actually address this in any way. So it is not only significant that Kelly Reichardt works in the Pacific Northwest because she uses the environment, but because Seattle itself is a woman-dominated film industry. And so one of the things that we talk about in that article is the way that like women have a particular power in the Pacific Northwest filmmaking industry, but it is a peripheral film industry. It's not Hollywood, it's not Atlanta, it's not Vancouver, right? It's kind of this in between or sort of at the edges, but that peripheral position actually allows women to claim this power in the filmmaking industry.
And that has significant ramifications on film production. Like there's less money for film production, there's less infrastructure for film production, but on the flip side, it also allows different types of stories to be told, right? Like they don't necessarily need to have that same emphasis on making money or something like that, or of operating according to a particular model which works within those larger markets like Hollywood and Atlanta. It's a great question. Did you use the term peripheral production, Chelsea? Is that?
It's in the title of our article. Claire was looking at the reference.
Oh, she's just looking at
that's up on the screen.
I see.
Yeah, I did not.
I see. Okay.
And yes, Cohen, one of the other things that I was thinking about with First Cow when I was trying to narrow my thoughts about women and Kelly Reichardt to something manageable was also the way that First Cow, even in maybe the absence of, you know, female protagonists, does still push back at traditional notions of gender. So yes, I think that's absolutely correct, in that we get this beautiful relationship between these two men. You know, they're making their cakes, like they're planning a future. And so, and I think, you know, Old Joy is also about a maybe not as beautiful relationship between two men, but I think it does allow to, it pushes back on these traditional notions of gender and what that should look like. And yeah, so I agree that's a good part of First Cow, even if it's about men.
So we have time for a couple more questions if people have them, or if you guys have any other final thoughts that you want to say.
Ooh. I guess I would say there's so much more to say, and I hope that if this was your first Kelly Reichardt film, that it will not be your last, and that you will go and find some more Kelly Reichardt films and watch them all. And then I will self-promotionally say that that forthcoming reference on our reference list by both of us is going to be available online for free. It's an open access journal, so that's one that you don't need to be affiliated with the university to access. And it explores some of what we've talked about today in relation to Meek's Cutoff and Kelly Reichardt and women making film out of the Seattle area.
And if you want to see any of these references or can't find these references, yeah, just go ahead and email us and we can get you access. And also, Reichardt's very prolific too. You know, she's been making a film every 2 or 3 years. So yeah, see other Reichardt films, but also, you know, be ready for the next one probably.
Oh boy, we're ready.
I guess First Cow just came out though. That's pretty recent, but
Yeah, probably got another year or two.
Yep, sorry.
All right. So I just want to thank you guys so much. This was absolutely fascinating, and I just always love talking about Kelly Reichardt. She actually came to Colby in 2014. And so, but that was before she was like really big. So I kind of look back on that. I'm like, oh my gosh, like she was there and I was not adequately excited, you know. I was like, okay, it's some filmmaker named Kelly Reichardt.
I was furious when I arrived at Colby and found out that
Yeah.
she had been there like the year before I came to Colby. I was like, what? You can't bring her before I come here. But, you
Bring her
know,
back.
we tried. And I think now she's too famous for us.
Oh,
She's too famous. She won't return my emails. It's fine.
Fine. Yeah. Julia, I want everyone to know that Julia did really try to get Kelly Reichardt to join us today so that this could have been a conversation with her.
Yes, I did try, but you know, no luck. Next time, maybe.
I can't wait until I'm that famous.
Yeah, exactly.
You might want to pick a different career, Matt. But.
All right. So thank you guys so much. This was amazing. And for everybody in attendance, I just want to plug our next Cinema Conversation. So this one is on March 3rd at 7:30, same time. And we'll be discussing feminism in Patty Jenkins' 2017 superhero blockbuster, Wonder Woman. So if you're interested in that, make sure to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media, and that's where you'll get those updates. So that's going to be a really cool one too.
See, if you didn't get enough narrative conclusion from this talk, you can go to that one. You get your narrative conclusion. That's good. Good combo.
All right. So thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time.